sense that they work for free.
No. I have to correct you.
Later you can correct it. And I get this information from Martini and Albert Hall. He said that when I work for Zhen Ginseng, how can I get the money back? No, they cannot. So, but most important is Paul become the chairman of the Bars Association in 2022. And then it became a very hard time for him. First of all, because in the middle of 2021, the Hong Kong government passed the National Security Law. And as a chair of the bar, it is very natural. A lot of reporters will ask the comment from Paul. And I read all this, that Paul make comments in a very professional way. But for the pro-Beijing newspaper, it doesn't matter whether you're professional or not. It just criticize you, make a lot of pressure. And I can really say that Paul later, March 2022, will let Hong Kong. But I said to Paul did a great work to Hong Kong on the rule of law and also help a lot of people. So it is an honor for us today. For the Open Mind Talk series, we have the honor to invite Paul to talk about the rule of law of Hong Kong. So this is a great time. And I only do the introduction. And then on the Q&A time, Dr. Zheng Cheng will take the chair to chair the session. So I give the time to Paul.
對唔住大家樂，我唔可以講係廣東話。我準備咗係英文，同埋我嘅廣東話唔係咁好，所以我而家可以講。Thank you very much, Li Wing-Tat, and thank you everybody for inviting me here today to speak. I've been asked to talk to you about my time as chairman of the Hong Kong Bar in 2021 to 2022, and also to give you my thoughts as to what the British government can do to help restore freedom in Hong Kong. So those are the subjects that I am going to talk about this afternoon. Before that, one little correction. Many of the cases I did in Hong Kong, which got publicity, were funded, sometimes by the legal aid department, sometimes other ways. So I don't want people to think that I was a completely altruistic, saintly person. I was just a normal barrister in that way. Now, a bit more about myself. I'm British, born and brought up in Oxford, my home city. I studied law at Oxford University, and I was called to the English bar in 1976, which tells you that I am quite ancient. I worked as a civil servant for many years in the Home Office and the Foreign Office before deciding to practice at the bar in my 30s. In the Foreign Office, I worked for the Overseas Development Administration, usually called ODA. I was the desk officer for Ethiopia and Somalia during part of the famine in the 1980s, which was a very important experience in my life. Because of that overseas experience, after I came to the bar, I was asked to be the first chairman of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales. That committee was set up in 1992 with a remit to help judges and lawyers overseas who were being persecuted or at risk of persecution for doing an honest job. It was my voluntary work as chairman of the Bar Human Rights Committee which brought me to Hong Kong in 1993 to see if the English bar could do anything to help the rule of law to survive in Hong Kong after Hong Kong's return to China in 1997. A lot of people told me on that visit that Hong Kong needed an independent watchdog to make sure that the promises in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration on the Future of Hong Kong were kept. Someone suggested that as I had set up the Bar Human Rights Committee in London, I was a good person to set up a watchdog for Hong Kong. They pointed out that if I came to live in Hong Kong to set up the watchdog, I could earn a good living as a barrister at the same time. After thinking about it for a while, I was persuaded. I was called to the Hong Kong Bar in 1993 and came to live in Hong Kong early in 1994. So I have been connected with Hong Kong for over 30 years. Now, in 1995, I founded the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor, Hong Kong Yan Kun Ganchat. This was the first Hong Kong human rights organisation working in both English and Chinese. It was intended to be the watchdog people had been talking about, to try to make sure that the promises of Hong Kong's continuing freedom were kept. Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor continued in existence for 25 years until it was forced to close in 2021 because of the Hong Kong National Security Law. I had little involvement with it in its later years, as I had always been keen that it should be run by Hong Kong people for Hong Kong people, but I know that it continued to do good work throughout its existence, monitoring the observance of human rights in Hong Kong. Sadly, under the new Article 23 legislation enacted this year, any similar organisation trying to hold the government to account will be illegal. I have loved Hong Kong since I first got to know it. As soon as I came to live there, I started to learn Cantonese. I was not a very talented learner, but after many years, I raised myself up by enormous efforts to a position of mediocre fluency. I got to know the territory extremely well, hiking its mountain trails and sailing a small boat around its bays and inlets. Hong Kong became my second home. I married a Hong Konger and for years had a Hong Kong family as well as my family in England. I spent some years from 2008 in England for family reasons, but continuing to come to Hong Kong several times a year to do cases in court. In 2020, I decided to move back to Hong Kong to live. It was never my ambition to be chairman of the Hong Kong Bar. Although I served on the Hong Kong Bar Council in 2004 and 2005, it had never occurred to me to think of being chairman. I had a wide range of other interests and activities which kept me very busy. However, I was persuaded to stand for chairman by Martin Ling, QC, the leader of Hong Kong's democracy movement and a leading barrister, and himself a former chairman of the bar. No one else wanted the job in 2021, so I was elected unopposed in January that year. A word about the job of chairman of the bar and the 25-person strong Bar Council which the chairman of the bar chairs. The Bar Council is the governing body of the barrister's profession, equivalent to the Law Society for solicitors or the Medical Council for doctors. It has four main tasks. Firstly, it is responsible for regulating entry to the barrister's profession through approval of pupillages, which are the apprenticeships new barristers have to go through before they can practice. Secondly, it is responsible for maintaining standards in the profession. most notably through disciplinary proceedings in response to complaints against barristers, but now also through requirements for continuing professional education. Thirdly, it's responsible for advising the government on the detailed content of legislation on which a number of Bar Council committees do a lot of hard and useful work. Unfortunately, in a trend that has accelerated in recent years, the government frequently ignores those comments. And fourthly, the bar in Hong Kong has a special role as a defender of the rule of law and human rights. This role is written into the bar's constitution and was followed by nearly all chairmen of the bar for many years before I became chairman. This meant that the bar had a much higher profile in Hong Kong than it does in London. I often found that people such as taxi drivers knew who I was in Hong Kong. I cannot imagine any taxi driver in London knowing the name of the chairman of the English bar. In fact, I wonder if anyone in this hall knows it. His name is Sam Townend, KC. I should add that most importantly, in a money-conscious city such as Hong Kong, much of the Bar Council's work is done voluntarily and unpaid by barristers with the assistance of a small employed secretariat. The posts of chairman of the bar, membership of the Bar Council, and membership of Bar Council committees are all unpaid. This is despite the fact that several of the posts, including the chairman, the bar secretary, and the chairman of the disciplinary committee of the Bar Council, are close to being full-time jobs in themselves. I myself was used to doing 2 full-time jobs, one paid and one unpaid. That was what I did as chairman of the Bar Human Rights Committee in London, and as chairman of Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor for 3 years around the turn of the century. However, I think the pool of people willing to take some of these onerous jobs would be increased if there was a small stipend payable, as happens in some other jurisdictions. As many of you will know, as soon as I became chairman, I was subjected to unprecedented, ferocious attacks by pro-Beijing media, including Chinese media outside Hong Kong. The main focus of these attacks was my criticism of the national security law imposed on Hong Kong by Beijing in 2020. These attacks were completely intemperate. I would like to quote you an article published at that time by the Hong Kong Free Press, which I like, not just because it's flattering to me, but also because it catches very much the atmosphere of what was happening. So I'm quoting it now. "The wolf warriors keep snarling away. Their latest target is the recently elected head of the city's Bar Association, Paul Harris, a mild-mannered, I should add sometimes, greatly accomplished and widely respected human rights barrister, had the temerity to question the merits of the harsh national security legislation imposed on the city by the Chinese leadership in late June of last year. The China State Council's Hong Kong and Macau office accused Harris of being hostile to the Communist Party, promoting discussion of Hong Kong independence, and using his British nationality to collude with foreign forces in interfering in Hong Kong affairs. Beijing's liaison office in Hong Kong eagerly joined in the assault, issuing a statement castigating Harris for disregarding the, quote, unquestionable and sacred power, unquote, of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, which wrote and promulgated the national security law, whose overreach the Bar Association has questioned since day one. The statement added that Harris had, quote, blatantly challenged the city's constitutional order, China's national sovereignty, and the bottom line of one country, two systems. The People's Daily chimed in, calling Harris arrogant and decrying his lost professionalism and rationality. And what did Harris actually say or do to provoke all this invective? After his January the 21st election as Bar Association chair, he had pledged to appeal to the Hong Kong government, quote, to agree to some modifications in the national security law, some of whose provisions are seen by many barristers as conflicting with individual rights guaranteed under Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law, unquote. That's the quotation from the Hong Kong Free Press. Now, as I hope is obvious to most of you, most of these statements by Chinese government media outlets were quite untrue. The Bar did not encourage the 2019 protests. Like the chairman then, and like all previous chairmen of the Hong Kong Bar, I am deeply committed to the rule of law. I actually wrote to the South China Morning Post, Nama Zhoubo, in 2019, calling for dialogue and an end to violence, but unfortunately my letter was not printed. I was a committed supporter of one country, two systems throughout my time in Hong Kong, and I never regarded Hong Kong independence as a viable alternative. However, I did very strongly defend the right of free speech. That includes the right of people to express views that the authorities find objectionable, which of course includes the right of people who support independence to express their views freely. This is what Scottish and Welsh nationalists do in the United Kingdom, and what supporters of Quebec independence do in Canada. Of course, that is not the mainland China tradition, where criticism of the government has historically not been tolerated. But it is the essence of a free society, and it is what China signed up to at least until 2047, when in 1984 it signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration on the Future of Hong Kong. I believe that free speech is a right so fundamental that it underpins many other rights. If breaches of other rights cannot be reported or discussed because of lack of free speech, then those breaches will not be remedied. Of course, in free societies, there is debate as to where the margins of free speech should lie in the areas of hate speech, obscenity, and defamation. But in Hong Kong, none of the points that my predecessors at the Bar Council or I were making were anywhere near those margins. They were rational and moderately worded expressions of concern related to the rights guaranteed in the Hong Kong Bill of Rights and the Hong Kong Basic Law. I think that many people in both the yellow and the blue camps in Hong Kong, for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know what that means, the pro-democracy camp and the pro-Beijing camp, possibly no one in this room didn't know what that means. Many people expected me to resign under the barrage of attacks on me. I had no intention of doing so, as I had done nothing that justified a resignation, and I knew that if I resigned, the Bar would have been emasculated and would lose its independence. At the same time as dealing with attacks from Beijing, I was defending the Hong Kong legal system against a destructive attack from Britain, led by the then Labour Party Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy and others in Britain were calling for overseas judges to withdraw from the Court of Final Appeal in protest at the national security law. This situation requires a bit of explanation of the background. Hong Kong's highest court, the Court of Final Appeal, was set up in 1997 at the handover to replace final appeals to the Privy Council in London. Its membership includes both the most senior judges in Hong Kong and a number of distinguished overseas judges. Most cases heard before the Court of Final Appeal have one overseas judge together with 4 local judges on the bench hearing the case. Now, these overseas judges are the most distinguished judges in the common law world. They include presidents and former presidents of the UK Supreme Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, and the High Court of Australia. They bring to Hong Kong immense knowledge and high-quality legal reasoning. As a result, they greatly contribute to maintaining standards, not just in the Court of Final Appeal, but in the whole Hong Kong court system. I know that some fanatical Chinese nationalists want them gone because they are not Chinese. I believe most other people in the Hong Kong legal world greatly value their contribution and are anxious that they should stay as long as possible. Calling for their departure was, in my view, totally destructive, and in April 2021 I put my view forcefully by a speech on video link to the English Bar Council. I was well received and I think had some effect in discouraging the calls for the overseas judges to go. The very day after I made that speech to the English Bar Council, I was the subject of new vitriolic attacks from the Chinese government media of an intensity even greater than before. They now began to express the sentiment that if the Hong Kong Bar did not get rid of Paul Harris, China would get rid of the Hong Kong Bar. Hearteningly, I seem to have strong support across the bar, with several people approaching me and seeking my assurance that I would not resign despite the barrage of attacks. Only 2 of the 1,500 Hong Kong barristers ever expressed to me the view that I should resign. One of those definitely changed his mind after a short conversation, and the other may also have done so. Now, it was clear that in the climate prevailing then, it was going to be damaging and possibly fatal for the bar to continue the same policy of high-profile opposition to the national security law, which had been adopted by my predecessor and initially by me. I did raise privately with the Hong Kong Secretary for Justice, Teresa Cheng, the issue of amending the law, but I was met with an absolute refusal to discuss the idea. Some barristers in the yellow camp were disappointed that I did not speak out more, but I am sure that my policy of not doing so was correct. 2021 was the year that the pro-democracy media, Apple Daily and Stand News, were suppressed and their editors arrested. The Pro-Democracy Confederation of Trade Unions and the Professional Teachers Union were also suppressed. Other media and many voluntary organisations were voluntarily disbanding themselves as they saw no way to continue under the threat of being accused under the national security law. Many people thought that the bar would be next, especially in the light of explicit threats made against it. It was my responsibility to try to ensure that an independent bar continued to exist and to make that my number one priority. So, instead of more political issues, I therefore concentrated from that point onward as much as possible on the many professional matters with which the bar was concerned, which I've already outlined just now. At that time, the bar had no requirement for continuing professional development. In this respect, it differed from the Hong Kong Law Society, from the English Bar, the English Law Society, and most professional bodies around the world. It has been increasingly recognised for decades that professional people should keep up their own professional standards by keeping abreast of new developments in the profession. Good professionals do this anyhow without it being compulsory. But some compulsion does, in my view, create momentum and a change of culture to make it more widely accepted that all professionals need to do this. The Hong Kong Bar had debated the issue of continuing professional development, known as CPD, for years. A few years previously, it had rejected compulsory CPD in favour of a voluntary self-reporting system. This had predictably failed, so the time was right to reconsider the issue. I'm proud of the fact that under my chairmanship, the Bar Council finally decided that CPD should be compulsory, and that new rule is now in force in Hong Kong. In carrying out my duties as chairman, I worked on my strongly held principle that I was the chairman for every one of the 1,500 members, whatever their political views. For that reason, I did something which had not been done by my predecessor, which was to take an interest in various initiatives designed to promote legal cooperation with adjacent parts of mainland China, usually referred to as the Greater Bay Area, in civil and commercial matters. Whatever one thought of the mainland legal system, for those barristers who spoke good Mandarin Chinese, of whom there were a significant number, work on the mainland might well provide an opportunity for remunerative work. It was therefore the Bar Council's job, in my view, to facilitate it. I attended various meetings of the Legislative Council and elsewhere about this. This caused some surprise among those involved, if they did not already know me, when they discovered that I was not the monster painted by mainland propaganda, but was an approachable person, very much inclined to support the initiatives they were involved in. I do not believe in all work and no play. I was keen to encourage the various sporting associations set up by some of the younger barristers, having myself previously rowed in the Bar's dragon boat crew. One issue which I strongly promoted against a huge amount of defeatist opposition was the idea of a Hong Kong legal walk. This was based on the long-established legal walks in London and Birmingham and other English cities, when lawyers walk, sponsored for charity. Nothing of that kind had been done in Hong Kong before, and I thought it would be both good in itself and good for the image of the bar as an organisation that cared about the community. In England, the charities supported by the legal walks are mostly legal charities, but that would have been too niche for Hong Kong, where the whole idea of a legal walk was such a novelty. After some debate, we selected 4 charities to be the legal walk's beneficiaries. They were the Hong Kong Cancer Campaign, Helpers for Domestic Helpers, the Association for the Victims of Industrial Accidents, and Changing Young Lives, which is a charity which helps young people who find themselves in difficult situations. At the time we first planned the walk, Hong Kong was under COVID restrictions that prevented most outdoor activities. We planned the walk first for the late spring of 2021, then for the autumn, but throughout this period, gatherings were restricted. We had hopes for the autumn, and in the summer, we held a press conference to publicise the walk. The conference seemed to go well, with representatives of the charities in attendance along with the media. I was therefore surprised to get a very panicky sounding phone call from a barrister who told me that she had been contacted by the Central Government Liaison Office, extremely concerned, that I had just addressed a meeting wearing a black mask. At that time, masks were compulsory in all public places in Hong Kong. I always wore a black one as I felt black looked better than white. Someone in the liaison office had interpreted this to mean that I was expressing solidarity with violent protesters who wore masks, although everyone in the room was wearing one and they were in many colours. My Bar Council colleague, Azan Marwa, to whom I had delegated the task of supervising the arrangements for the walk, was wearing a blue mask next to me on the platform that day. Blue could have been regarded as the colour of the Project Beijing camp if the masks had any meaning, which they did not. I was anxious that the walk would break down the popular image of barristers, which was, frankly, not flattering, although undoubtedly tinged with envy. An example of this came to me when I needed a dinner jacket for a formal event, and I went to an outfitter's to be measured. The very nice lady who measured me looked puzzled. "Are you really a barrister?" she said. "You are so thin. Barristers are out here." She made a gesture of a substantial paunch. "And they wear a lot of jewellery. You are not wearing any jewellery." I had pleasure in telling her that I was the head of the barristers' profession, but I do not know if she believed me. The Hong Kong walk did eventually take place and raised about $1 million Hong Kong dollars for charity, but not until after I left Hong Kong. It has continued and it has become an annual event. During the second half of my chairmanship, I received repeated personal threats of arrest, delivered through intermediaries, apparently from mainland officials. None of them specified what crime I was going to be arrested for. I took the view that I had done nothing wrong and should carry on with my duties as chairman. But working in this atmosphere was difficult. I had to keep chairing the Bar Council and taking decisions, while also socialising with the judges and with members of the Hong Kong government at a variety of formal events, while wondering if I was going to have a knock on my door at 6 a.m. and find police outside. Then in December, I received a warning from a reliable Hong Kong source that I would not be arrested while I was chairman, but must leave Hong Kong very soon after I finished my term. I did successfully complete my one-year term and hand over to an independent successor as chairman, elected by the members. Then I got ready to leave, which felt very sad as I had planned to stay in Hong Kong much longer. I recently gave an interview to Green Bean Media, which some of you may have seen, in which I described how 5 days before I was due to leave Hong Kong, I was called in by the security police and interviewed under caution with a view to charging me with sedition. I will not say more about that now, except that to this day I do not know if there really was an intention to charge me with sedition, or whether the hope was just to make sure that I left and did not come back. I left that night, and very sadly, I will probably never be able to return to my second home. I would now like to say a bit more about the Hong Kong National Security Law and why it has been opposed by me, by very many Hong Kong lawyers, and by democratically minded people in Hong Kong and around the world. I would like to make it clear that I am not someone who is opposed to all national security laws. Nearly every country has such laws, and they are sometimes needed. All democratic countries are threatened by people who despise democracy and would like to overthrow it and replace it by one or other kind of democracy. The United Kingdom and Australia both have national security laws. The long history of IRA, Irish Republican Army, Islamic and far-right terrorism in the UK remind us that they are necessary. However, there is always a tension between the important goal of defending a country against the enemies of freedom and the need to avoid actually eroding freedom in the name of protecting it. In the United Kingdom, there is a government-appointed independent reviewer of terrorism legislation intended to ensure that operations under those laws remain justified and do not result in injustice or abuse. It follows that there are many provisions in the Hong Kong national security law which are not objectionable in themselves. On the contrary, many of them are similar to provisions in anti-terrorism or national security legislation around the world. To people familiar with that type of legislation, they do not appear controversial. The difficulty with the Hong Kong national security law is with about half a dozen key provisions which, taken together, effectively abolish many of Hong Kong's previous freedoms. The law introduces offences of subversion and secession, which did not previously exist in Hong Kong. Both subversion and secession are well-known concepts in the mainland, where those offences have often been used to persecute opponents of the regime. Worse, the law contains no definition of the offences, so it's left to the courts to decide what the elements of the offences are, and prosecutors to decide who they will bring to court. The law purports to reassert the right of free speech, but then states that it does not apply to speech favouring secession, which in local terms means support for the independence of Hong Kong or of any other territory which China regards as part of its national territory, including Taiwan. Hong Kong has had a well-established localism movement, some of which is mainly concerned with preserving Hong Kong's distinctive culture and the Cantonese language, but some of which explicitly favoured Hong Kong independence. This is a point of view which is now criminalised, even if peacefully expressed. Another new offence created by the law, also completely undefined, is collusion with foreign forces. This is what the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office accused me of in January 2021. I have had no connection with the British government since I stopped being a civil servant in 1989, and never knowingly helped a foreign government to interfere in Hong Kong affairs either before or during my term as Hong Kong Bar Chairman. However, this offence is so sweeping that it is difficult to know what it means. On its face, it could mean anything, from spying to accepting money from a foreign organisation, to expressing agreement with overseas criticism of China, or to having foreign friends, difficult to avoid if one is oneself in Hong Kong terms a foreigner. Equally serious is the provision which exempts from any legal challenge the decisions of the new National Security Committee, set up under the law with the Chief Executive as its head, assisted by mainland as well as Hong Kong officials. In one sentence, that provision has removed the rule that entered Hong Kong with the English common law in 1845, and which has been a key part of English law since the Middle Ages, that the ruler is subject to the law. Now, that principle has been avoided or ignored on numerous occasions in English history, but it has always remained a fundamental principle. The medieval English lawyer, Henry Bracton, used a Latin tag to describe it, The Latin is very famous among English lawyers. Rex non est sub hominem sed sub Deo et sub lege. And it means the king is beneath no man but beneath God and the law. That was the law of Hong Kong until the national security law. In 21st century Hong Kong, it meant that it was perfectly normal for a court case to be brought against the chief executive. However, the new security law means that it is impossible to bring a case against the chief executive if he acts through the new National Security Committee. In effect, the provision removes all effective judicial scrutiny from the actions of the security police and enables the Hong Kong government to act like a police state. As if this is not enough, the law also gives power to the government's chief legal official, the Secretary for Justice, to remove the right to jury trial from any national security case. The jury has always been a safeguard against state oppression or political prosecution, as shown dramatically in 18th century England, when juries refused to convict peaceful parliamentary reform campaigners of treason. The law also takes universal jurisdiction for all the offences created, not limited to Chinese citizens. So a British person in Britain who expresses criticism of China could be prosecuted if they ever set foot in Hong Kong. It would seem to catch Lisa Nandy, now a cabinet minister, for her calls for the overseas judges to leave the Court of Final Appeal. The law also provides that in serious cases involving national security offences in Hong Kong, the trial can be moved to the mainland. This is far worse than the Fugitive Offenders Bill, which triggered the protests in 2019. Extraditions, which is what the Fugitive Offenders Bill was about, are subject to court challenge. Removal to the mainland under the new law would be an administrative decision by the National Security Committee, which could not be challenged in the courts. I consider these provisions to be clear and flagrant breaches of the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. I said so when the National Security Law was published in 2020, and that remains my view. The question arises whether anything can be done about this by Britain, or whether Hong Kong has now become a lost cause. Now, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is or was until recently a member of the same barristers' chambers that I am in, Doughty Street Chambers. While he was leader of the opposition, I had the opportunity to raise the subject of Hong Kong with him. He made his view very clear to me that he considered that there was nothing to be done for Hong Kong. I profoundly disagree with this view, and I consider it to be regrettable. Talking of Prime Ministers, I am no fan at all of our former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But among his many sins, he did do the decent thing for Hong Kong in granting all Hong Kong people eligible for a British national overseas passport, i.e. that means people born in Hong Kong before 1997 and their dependents, the right to come to live in Britain. That decision has transformed Hong Kong and the UK in that it has led to some 180,000 Hong Kongers coming to relocate here, to the UK's gain and Hong Kong's loss. But I do not think that is enough. There are still millions of people in Hong Kong brought up in a rule of law society which was developed and shaped by the United Kingdom. Many of them are eligible to come to the UK, but they cannot do so as they do not have the language skills or the capital to enable them to relocate here. I believe that the British government should be trying to help everyone in that category. And I believe that if the will is there, the British government can do much more to pressure China to observe the terms of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. Now, I do not believe in what's called grandstanding, which is simply saying things to sound good and make your audience think that they're great. Searing public criticisms of China, such as those uttered by the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, are unlikely to achieve anything except a riposte from Chinese government wolf warriors in similar confrontational language. I believe that it is possible for Britain to do something much more constructive to secure the observance of the Sino-British Joint Declaration if this issue is linked to other issues in British-Chinese relations. China regularly denounces complaints from Britain about lack of respect for the freedoms guaranteed in the Joint Declaration as an interference in its internal affairs. This is wrong. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is an international treaty registered at the United Nations. Britain is just as entitled to complain about its non-observance as any party to an international treaty is entitled to complain if another party breaches it. Britain has a vast range of different areas in which it has contacts with China. It's fashionable to say that Britain is now weak compared with the rising power of China and not in a position to insist on anything. I consider that this view is much exaggerated, if not completely wrong. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of all the different areas of contact between Britain and China, whether in relation to trade and tariffs, to possible joint ventures, to science and technology, to medicine, or to education. But I am sure that despite China's relative economic strength, there must be occasions when China wants something specific from Britain in one of the areas I have just mentioned. I think it would be reasonable and the best chance of achieving a result if negotiations on these other issues were linked to the Hong Kong freedom issues. I think this is particularly so because if one thinks of the size of China, with over 1,400 million inhabitants, Hong Kong, by comparison, is a rather small entity. It's now 5 years since the breakdown of law and order in 2019. Even the release of Jimmy Lai, Hong Kong's most well-known pro-democracy prisoner, would seem a small matter for the central government of China if set against possible lucrative new trading arrangements which might create thousands or tens of thousands of new jobs in China. As well as Jimmy Lai, there are others in prison in Hong Kong who appear to be detained because they have been advocates of a democratic China. This is, of course, something the Chinese government is deeply against, but it is a classic example of the free speech which the Joint Declaration was supposed to guarantee. It does not seem a big ask in the overall context of British-Chinese relations that the release of these people should also be included in negotiations. So those are my thoughts on future British policy on Hong Kong, and I do hope that someone in a position of authority is listening. Now, before I stop, I've also been asked to say something about two other questions. The first is what can be done by people here about the situation in Hong Kong and China. This is a difficult question because there is not much that can be done in the short term. However, this brings me back to the important subject of free speech, which I have talked about already. I have heard from many people how mainland Chinese students in the UK are inhibited in joining in discussions because they know that they are being monitored by Chinese government agents here who will report back anything they say which is critical of the Chinese Communist Party or otherwise against Chinese government policy. The Confucius Institutes, which exist in a number of universities, are widely suspected of being fronts for Chinese government monitoring of mainland students. This is really unacceptable. The very essence of being a student is being free to experiment with new ideas and say things which may be controversial or provocative. It's intolerable that some students cannot join in debate for fear of their words being secretly reported and used against them or their families. I did discuss not long ago with an academic at Oxford University the possibility of banning such organisations and societies. His view was that it was not worth the trouble, because they would just re-emerge under a different name. I'm not sure if that's true, but if it is true, another possible approach might be for universities to ban passing certain kinds of information about a student to a foreign government without the student's permission. The drafting of such a rule would require care so as not to catch innocent passing of information, such as in job references, but I think it could be done in such a way as to be effective. In any case, I'm certain that encouraging and defending free speech in British universities will make a contribution to promoting freedom around the world, including in China. And now lastly, the other thing I've been asked to address is, should young Hong Kongers still go into the legal profession in Hong Kong in the present climate? The answer really depends on the individual. Hong Kong at present no longer offers the freedom of debate which exists in Western democracies and which used to exist there. For some people, the atmosphere of enforced conformity or silence will not be tolerable. However, I do not think that freedom in Hong Kong is irretrievably lost. If one looks at Chinese history, official Chinese policy often changes dramatically. For example, if one thinks of the change between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. We do not know what the future holds, and I think it is premature to write off the legal profession in Hong Kong. So if someone feels that they are more at home in Hong Kong than in another place, and they want to be a lawyer, I would encourage them to follow their ambition and become one there. So those are all my thoughts, and thank you very much for listening.